Hello there and welcome to the Emerald Nightmare. My name is Tuskeh and in this video we are going to go over everything you need to know to defeat Nythendra in the Emerald Nightmare on normal and heroic difficulties. She's the first boss of the Emerald Nightmare and you'll be facing her in a circular chamber. This is a two-phase fight with no adds, and it revolves around controlling the placement of large puddles of green poison called Infested Ground to ensure that your raid team has room to maneuver. These infested ground pools will naturally deal damage to you if you stand in them. In Phase 1, you'll be fighting Nythendra and dealing with how she places the pools of infested ground, and in Phase 2, Nythendra will collapse and stop attacking briefly whilst the infested ground moves towards her. How she goes between phases is denoted by her energy bar. When it reaches 0, she goes into Phase 2, and then, after it reaches 100 again, she'll return to Phase 1. On heroic difficulty and above, all of Nythendra's mechanics will apply a stack of Infested to everyone that they hit. This is a stacking debuff that deals damage over time and is permanent. This debuff is removed when Nythendra goes through Phase 2 and returns to Phase 1. Nythendra's most impactful ability is Infested Breath. Nythendra faces a random player in the raid and breathes in, giving them a couple of seconds to react. After that, she spews a huge poisonous breath in a cone in front of her, dealing damage to anyone caught within. This also creates a large number of infested ground pools. Nythendra will also place Rot on random raid members throughout Phase 1. This is a 9-second long debuff that causes the player to deal damage to themselves and other nearby players. When Rot expires, the player will create several pools of infested ground around them. The tank mechanic for this fight is Volatile Rot. This places an 8-second debuff on Nythendra's target that, after it expires, will explode for extremely heavy damage to the raid. This is drop-off damage, however, meaning that the further the tank is from other players, the less damage they will take. When Volatile Rot expires, it will create several patches of infested ground, just like the normal Rot ability. Despite being a dragon, as far as we could tell, she does not have a Tail Lash ability. In Phase 2, Nythendra will remain stationary and not attack, but she will continue to be attackable. During this 20-second phase, the infested ground pools will slowly move towards her, disappearing into her body. If they move over a player, they will naturally damage them. Additionally, during this phase, a swarm of insects will cover the room. These are untargetable and unattackable, and do nothing on their own. However, periodically, random insects will swell in size and begin to deal high damage to players nearby. Once Nythendra finishes Phase 2, all infested stacks are removed and she returns to Phase 1. Those are all of the mechanics Nythendra has. Now let's discuss strategy. As mentioned at the start of this video, this fight is all about how you place the infested ground pools and relies upon situational awareness. The better your raid performs in Phase 1, the more room they'll have in Phase 2, and the less danger they'll be in. We used Bloodlust as soon as the fight began. We decided to tank Nythendra in approximately the center of the room, facing the entrance. The tanks stood atop one another, as she has no cleave attack. The raid was evenly split into two groups situated on Nythendra's sides, loosely spread out to ensure that Rot's initial few ticks didn't kill anyone before the infected player could react. Whenever Nythendra casted Infested Breath, it would always be towards one of these two groups. As soon as she began to cast the breath, melee players in the targeted group would run through her hitbox to the other side, and ranged players would sidestep to a safe location. After that, they would return to their side and find safe places to stand in between the infested ground. This strategy worked because Nythendra only uses Infested Breath twice before entering Phase 2, so even if it targeted the same group twice, they could simply move through the boss the second time and be safe for Phase 2. Whenever a player was targeted by Rot, they would simply move around their group to place the infested ground pools created by the debuff timing out at the very edges of the room, directly behind their group. One piece of advice here is not to wait until it's got a few seconds left. Move out immediately, especially if you're a melee, because you're going to be taking up room because you'll be dealing AoE damage around you. When the tank was infected with Volatile Rot, the other tank would taunt, and the tank afflicted with the debuff would run towards the entrance of the room to get as much distance as they could to the raid. After the debuff expired, they simply moved back into range of the boss. The goal here was to place infested ground pools on Nythendra's left, right, and front, leaving the area behind her as clear as possible. Once Phase 2 began, the raid team would loosely spread behind Nythendra in the area that's clear of infested ground. We would continue to deal damage to her and made a point to aim our cameras directly down at the ground to watch the various insects there. Once they grew large and began to deal damage around them, players moved away. This portion of the fight can be particularly punishing to melee players, so consider stepping away from melee range as soon as an insect grows large there, rather than stepping around it and into the path of the infested grounds that are moving towards Nythendra. This is pretty much a recipe for disaster. These insects deal extremely high damage, so using immunities or damage mitigation when near them is a good idea. There aren't any huge sources of constant raid damage in this fight, but on Heroic, high infested stacks can put a lot of stress on your healers. Bear in mind that infested is only removed when Nythendra ends Phase 2 and returns to Phase 1. Healing and survivability cooldowns are best used personally when you're at high stacks of infested. More than 10 is dangerous, so big area healing cooldowns will be helpful mostly in Phase 2, although beware of channeled spells since that's going to be a risky play thanks to insects growing nearby at random. Communication and personal awareness is going to be a big factor in this fight. Once Phase 2 ended, we returned to our positions from Phase 1 and the fight repeated itself. The biggest source of trouble on this fight were players who were improperly positioned, since an infested breath aimed at the back of the room, or even slightly angled towards the back of the room, can be extremely harmful, so positioning is key here. The only exception to this is when Nythendra begins to use Infested Breath as the Rot players are moving into position to drop their pulls. This can be very dangerous. In these situations, it can be worthwhile to place Rot closer to the front or the back of the room near the edge of Infested Breath's radius. I would definitely suggest the front of the room if you can find a safe location. That's it for this fight. Nythendra is much more about handling mechanics than she is pure damage, so focus way more on not standing in green stuff and positioning yourself and placing all of the infested ground pools in good positions, and you'll be fine. That will conclude this guide. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, or suggestions, then you can contact me using the links in the description, or you can just leave a comment. If you want to help support the channel, then you can find a link to my Patreon page in the description as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I wish you the best of luck in the Emerald Nightmare.
Hey!